Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew and welcome to my Sewing for Beginners series. Now in this short video I'm going to be showing you how you can use a zigzag stitch to help to finish the edges of your fabric and to prevent them from fraying. We're going to be using a zigzag stitch on your standard sewing machine, so as long as you have access to a zigzag stitch, this tutorial will work for you. To use the zigzag to finish the edges of your fabric, you're going to want to begin by sewing the seam in your fabric. In this example, I have sewn the seam here using a 5/8 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Obviously, you would simply work with the seam allowance for your project or garment that you're making. Then you would press your seam, whether you're pressing it open or with the seam allowances to one side. Next, we're going to head to the sewing machine and we're going to complete the zigzag stitch in about the middle of the seam allowance. The key here with this method is that we're not going to try and do it too close to the edge. We're going to aim to do it further in, so about the middle, and then we're going to trim close to the zigzag to help prevent fraying. Now you'll need to think about whether your seam allowances are designed to be pressed open like this, in which case you will need to complete this stitch down one side of the seam allowance, turn your piece of fabric around and complete it down the other side. Or whether your seam allowances are designed to be pressed to one side, in which case, if I was pressing them to one side like so, I could complete the zigzag with the seam allowances together and then press them in the right direction. Join me at the sewing machine and I will show you how to complete this stitch. Set your machine up to do a zigzag stitch. Choose the zigzag stitch button and then amend the width and length if it's possible to do so. The width that I'm working with is 2 millimeters and the length that I'm working with is 1 millimeter. If your machine does not allow you to choose the width and length for your zigzag stitch, then you're going to want to choose a zigzag stitch that is very small in width and length. You want to have a little play on your machine to make sure that you're using a stitch that looks similar to the size that I've got here. Now I'm aiming to stitch not on the edge of the seam allowance here. I'm stitching approximately in the middle. But anywhere is fine as long as you're not stitching too close to the edge, because you will find that it perhaps will chew up the fabric, depending on the fabric that you're working with. I'm using the zigzag stitch with a width of 2 and a length of 1 millimeter. My foot's down and my needle is in my fabric. Then I'm going to do a small forwards and backwards, and you can do a forwards and backwards with a zigzag stitch. It doesn't look the neatest, but in this case we want it to be secure. And then we are simply going to feed the fabric through the sewing machine, completing this stitch. And you will see that it's a nice small zigzag stitch. And you will do this all the way down the seam allowances. You can see here that I'm doing this so that I can press my seam allowances open, but obviously if you're pressing your seam allowances to one side, you can complete it through both layers of the seam allowance at the same time. The direction that you press your seam allowances is going to depend on what you're making, and it will hopefully be in your pattern instructions depending on what it is you're creating. When you get to the end of the seam, you're going to do a backwards for a couple of stitches, forwards for a couple of stitches to secure. And then I would need to do the same on my other seam allowance here. And there you can see is my small zigzag. Once you've done the same on the other side, I will show you how to trim very close to this zigzag stitch. So as you can see, this sample here I have done on both sides because I've pressed my seam allowances open. And this one I have done with the seam allowances together. It's being pressed to one side. The next step before you start trimming like I've done here is to press your stitching. You'll find that the zigzag will sit better in the fabric if you give it a quick press now, and it will also make sure that your seam allowances are pressed in the correct direction before trimming them down, because depending on the fabric you're using, any extra pressing once you have trimmed them could cause more fraying. So I recommend giving everything a press now and then grab yourself a pair of nice sharp scissors so that we can trim very close to the zigzag. And you can see how close I have trimmed on this side here. You want to be really close to the zigzag, but you do not want to cut through the stitching. Hold the rest of the fabric out of the way to make sure that you don't accidentally cut through the rest of your project. Using a sharp pair of small scissors, cut really close to the zigzag stitch, but do not cut through it. And this should help to prevent fraying. As I said before, it's worthwhile giving it a press first. With certain fabrics, even pressing can cause it to fray, so it will help to prevent any further fraying. Just like so. And there you have my trimmed seam allowances. This little zigzag stitch should help to prevent fraying. However, if you have the facilities on your sewing machine to do a zigzag stitch over the edge of the fabric or an overcast stitch, then you're welcome to give that a try as well. It's worthwhile trying all of these different techniques on the fabric that you're working with, because you will find that different fabrics work better with different techniques. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for watching and good luck finishing the edges of your fabric in the future.